If you've already read all of the trial scene, this will be a quick review for you. If you have not read all of the trial scene, this will fill in some of those blanks for you. Now, along with this, you're going to want to make sure you complete that trial organizer. So if you haven't done that yet, make sure you are doing that as we go through this quick summary of the trial scene. First up, we have Hectate. He is the sheriff of Maycomb County. We've seen him before when we had the rabid dog on the Finch Street. We also see him pass the gun off to Atticus to do the shooting for him. Now, Hectate, well, maybe he gets some things wrong sometimes, doesn't feel confident in his shooting skills. He does seem to be honestly trying to tell his recollection of what happened. So the way he remembers November 21st, which is the day they say this rape had occurred, he says that he was called to the Yule house by Bob Yule. He came over to the Yule house. He sees Mayella. She's lying in the front room on the floor when he gets there. And then we also hear from him that her face was very beat up and she had bruises all over her body. Now, there is a point here where we see when Atticus is talking with Hectate, he becomes a little bit confused. So let's explain that really quickly. Hectate originally says the bruising on Mayella's face was primarily on her left side. However, he was thinking as he was looking at her, it was on his left, but that would make it the right side of her body. That is important, so keep that in mind. So we find out that Mayella was primarily beaten on the right side of her face, which would most likely mean that somebody was swinging with their left arm at Mayella. We also see bruises all around her neck, which seems to indicate that somebody tried to strangle her and put their whole hand or hands around her neck. Another point worth mentioning here is that Atticus brings up numerous times the fact that nobody called the doctor. So he asks, did anybody call a doctor? And he asks it several times, and he'll continue to ask it throughout the testimonies here. But we find out that no doctor was called, which is important because that means there's no medical evidence that rape has even occurred. Next up, we have Mr. Bob Yule, and boy, is he a looker. Now, when Bob Yule approaches the stand, he has his chest puffed out, he's strutting, and we see that he seems to be enjoying the fact that he has all this attention. Think about it. The people of Maycomb normally just ignore Bob Yule or talk about him behind his back. None of them ever really listen to what he has to say, so he seems to enjoy being center stage here. And he even cracks some jokes. For example, when Atticus asks him if he can read and write, he makes a joke about, oh, well, how do you think I signed those relief checks? And everyone kind of chuckles because he's making a joke at his own expense. So we see he seems to be enjoying the attention here on stand. Also, it indicates because he's not taking it seriously, he just assumes that the jury is going to take his side because he is a white man who's, and it's his word against Tom Robinson's. Now, we don't find out a ton of new information from Bob Yule as far as what happened on November 21st. He does say that he hears Mayella, he then goes towards the window in the house, at the Yule house, and then he spots Tom attacking Mayella through the window. He also talks about how he ran to go get Mr. Hectate, the sheriff. We then hear Atticus again ask, did anybody call a doctor? And Bob Yule's response is, well, I saw who done it, so I didn't need to call a doctor. And Atticus says, well, her injuries were bad enough to warrant a doctor. Didn't you want her to get medical attention? And again, this doesn't seem to be sinking in with Bob. He's like, oh, well, I knew who done it, so I didn't need to. And Atticus keeps reiterating, but she needed medical attention. So finally he says, well, I've never taken a child of mine to the doctor. It would cost $5. As far as Mayella's injuries go, he says he agrees with everything Hectate said. Atticus even goes to the court reporter, has the court reporter repeat what Hectate said, and he says, yes, I agree with everything Hectate has said. He also mentions that the room looks as though everything was slung about, as though there were some sort of fight, even though Hectate didn't mention anything about the room looking out of place. Now, before Bob Yule leaves the stand, Atticus does something that is very curious at first, and then we see why he's doing it. He asks Mr. Yule if he can read and write, and then he has Mr. Yule sign his name on a piece of paper. And so we see that Bob Yule is left-handed because he signs with his left hand. And remember, we know that Mayella's bruises were primarily on the right side of her face, which would mean somebody was leading with their left hand, which seems to suggest that whoever was harming Mayella may have been left-handed. And that seems to be what Atticus is suggesting here. However, Scout, as she's watching this, says, well, someone could have easily held her down with the right hand and swung with the left. It didn't have to be a left-handed person, or Tom Robinson could even be left-handed. However, it's clear that Atticus thinks that this is an important point to show the jury and the audience in the courtroom. All right, next up we have Mayella Yule, and we see that she approaches the stand different than her father does. So Bob Yule is acting all overconfident as he approaches the stand, and Mayella Yule is a little bit more timid. She even starts to cry, saying that she doesn't want Atticus to trick her and make her look bad like he made her father look bad. We also see that at numerous points during her testimony, she is confused with Atticus's demeanor and they have misunderstandings. So the first one is when Atticus keeps calling her ma'am and miss. She gets angry and says that Atticus is making fun of her, which he's just trying to be polite. And we can draw the conclusion that nobody has really ever treated her with respect. So she interprets Atticus's courtesy as him being mean to her and making fun of her. We also see that she has the same reaction when he asks about her friends, and she gets angry and upset, and this indicates to us that she's so isolated that she doesn't have any friends, and that she gets angry and can't even fathom that Atticus would believe she had friends and would ask about them. So we see that there's this disconnect there. Atticus, in asking about her friends, is also trying to point out her isolation. We know that she doesn't go to school anymore, and she only went for a couple years. We know that she's forced to take care of all the Yule children by herself most of the time, and she has 7 little brothers and sisters, and she's only 19 herself. So Atticus does build for the jury this picture of the Yule's life. And again, it's a life of poverty, and for Mayella particularly, it's also a life of isolation. And she's put in a situation that most 19-year-olds don't have to deal with. Now, Atticus does start to bring up her relationship with her father, and it seems throughout this testimony that Atticus is starting to insinuate that Bob Yule was in fact the one who beat his daughter and inflicted these injuries. And he even asks her about the relationship directly. This is on page 245. Atticus let her question answer his. "Do you love your father, Miss Mayella?" was his next. "Love him? What you mean? I mean, is he good to you? Is he easy to get along with?" "He does tolerable, except when... Mayella looked at her father, who was sitting with his chair tipped against the railing. He sat up straight and waited for her to answer. "Except when nothing," said Mayella. "I said he does tolerable." Mr. Yule leaned back again. "Except when he's drinking?" asked Atticus so gently. Mayella nodded. So we see here that Mayella is a bit intimidated by her father in this scene. When Bob Yule sits up, he clearly is worried about what Mayella is going to reveal as far as his abuse goes. And so we see that Mayella kind of backs down from what she was originally about to say about her father. But when Atticus says it just to her and says it so softly, she nods a little at him. It's also really important to note that Mayella keeps on wavering back and forth as far as whether or not Tom Robinson even hit her. So Atticus asks directly, and she says at first, "I can't recollect if he hit me. I mean, yes, he hit me." And she keeps on having this back and forth, and it makes her seem as though either she's making things up as she goes, or maybe she's starting to feel guilty for making this false accusation against Tom, but clearly her story is just not lining up. After Mayella has gone back and forth in her testimony, Atticus finally makes her point out the man who raped her. She points to Tom Robinson, and Atticus has him stand up. And part of the description goes like this on page 248. His left arm was fully 12 inches shorter than his right and hung dead at his side. It ended in a small, shriveled hand, and from as far away as the balcony, I could see that it was no use to him. So as the story continues, we find out that he got it caught in a cotton gin as a boy, and basically it tore all the muscles off of his arm. So he doesn't even have the ability to use his left arm. Now, this is extremely important information given Mayella's injuries, which were primarily on the right side, meaning somebody was swinging most likely with their left, and Tom has no access to his left hand. We also know that there were bruises all around her neck, as though someone were trying to strangle her with both hands. And again, Tom would not have been able to do this with only one hand. After this, Atticus continues to push Mayella and to try to get her to essentially tell the truth and to say what happened. And she eventually gets so worked up that she bursts into tears and runs off the stand. And there's nothing that can be done after this point because she's just completely in a state where nobody can get any sort of response out of her. All right, the last testimony we see is Tom Robinson's, and this is where we start to get some differing information. For example, Atticus, when he was talking with Mayella, brings up that there were no children on the property. And Mayella never really addresses this. No one really ever says why the other Yule children weren't there. And we find out that Tom says Mayella told him that she had saved up for an entire year to buy them ice cream, which was a nickel for each child. And so we see that Mayella was trying to get Tom alone here, that she had premeditated this, that she was trying to make it so the children weren't around when Tom was there so she could be alone with him. Also, unlike Mayella's testimony, we see that Tom wasn't just there on November 21st. Mayella said that was the only time she had ever met him or really seen him. And Tom said, no, he had in fact helped her many times. And so this incident where he was supposedly busting up the chifforobe, he said that happened way last spring. And the day, November 21st, the day that Mayella said Tom had raped her, he says he went into the house because she said he had something to chop for her, and then she didn't have anything. Then she had him go get something and stand on a chair. She attempts to go and hug him, and then when he jumps down, he's frazzled, and then she tries to kiss him. Tom also reveals that Bob Yule was looking through the window and did see Mayella attempting to kiss Tom, and he came into the house and started yelling at Mayella, and Tom said he was so scared that he ran. Now, Mr. Gilmer, the prosecuting attorney, is trying to say, well, he ran, so that indicates guilt. However, Tom Robinson reveals that he had no other choice. If he stayed there, Bob might have attempted to kill him, or he would have gotten in trouble for associating with a white woman. However, running away also made him look guilty. So for Tom Robinson, this is a lose-lose situation. He really had no good options. One last point about Tom's testimony is that when he is asked why he continued to help Mayella Yule, he says that he felt sorry for her, and he knows right away that this is a mistake, and the white audience members are appalled by him saying this. And that's because in their minds, it's the same as him saying that he's better than Mayella, and that him saying he feels sorry for her is unacceptable. And really, we're seeing he was just feeling empathy for this woman who he recognizes is isolated, who he sees nobody helping, and he wants to help her out of the kindness of his heart. But now, unfortunately, he's having to fight for his life on trial because he decided to show this woman kindness. So, Mayella Yule, Bob Yule, Tom Robinson, and Sheriff Hectate are the only 4 witnesses that testify. Another important part of the trial scene is Atticus's closing argument. And again, he's not a witness, he's a lawyer, but he's giving this closing statement to the jury. And what he says is he talks about how there was no medical evidence. He also outlines how it would have been impossible for Tom to inflict the injuries that Mayella suffered. He suggests that it was Bob Yule who in fact inflicted those injuries on Mayella. And he also talks about Mayella and feeling bad for her to a certain extent. Yes, she is isolated. Yes, she does not have a good life experience. She's poor. Her father doesn't help her. Her father most likely beats her. However, he cannot use her life experience to justify what she does here, because she is knowingly sentencing a man to death, essentially, by making this accusation. Atticus also gives us insight here as to why Mayella maybe did what she did. So Tom Robinson is probably one of the only people who has ever shown her any kindness or respect, and she is attracted to him, and she decides to try to get him alone and to make a move on him, which he rejects. And she sees this as shameful, because that's what society has led her to believe, that it is shameful for you to fall in love with somebody outside of your race. So Atticus also says that her attempt at making Tom Robinson disappear to get rid of Tom Robinson is essentially to bring him to court here. However, it's not like stolen contraband where you could just give it back or no harm done. This is a man's life she's putting at stake here. All right, so those are the big takeaways from the trial. Make sure you're reaching out to your teacher if you have any questions. See ya.